I don't remember how many girls were in the room, but I know it was myself and another young lady, African-American young lady. So we were the only two, probably in a classroom of 28 students in the class. So the other student, she asked the question. She said, "Oh, when are you going to teach African-American history or African history, Asian history, and other histories of people from other parts of the world?" Because as he was going through the syllabus, he was talking about, he started with early ancient Civ and moving into medieval, Dark Ages and medieval, and then the Renaissance. And then somehow you catapulted from the Renaissance to World War I and World War II. And then that was it. So when she asked the question, and I was really happy that she did, he said, "Oh, I don't teach that." And so I sat there, I'm like, oh, I think I'm going to become a history teacher. I don't know.
Welcome to Show Your Receipts, where we believe if you can see it, you can be it. Receipts are evidence or proof that something has occurred. Our guests are evidence that Black excellence is alive and well. They will be sharing their receipts on how they've been able to accomplish so much in their life. I'm your host, Tony Jackson. Let's get started. Welcome to Show Your Receipts, where we believe if you can see it, you can be it. I am super excited to introduce our guest today. I'm going to read her bio. She has an incredible bio. Felicia Clotsworthy has dedicated her life's work in education for 33 years. Her professional experiences are quite extensive, beginning with her role as the K-12 social science and ELA teacher, advancing in her career to diverse senior administrative leadership roles. Felicia has immense experience in local, district, and regional work as an educational consultant, director of program development and strategic implementation, director of student services, dean of students, curriculum director, divisional director, operational management, and school principal. In addition, she has served on numerous committees, executive committees, and school boards. Felicia will soon become Children of Peace Elementary School's next principal, and describes her philosophy of education as a person who, quote, believes individuals can truly thrive at their best when given diverse opportunities that are equitable and inclusive. Not only supporting educational systems that encourage and invite innovative teaching and learning, but as a designer of educational structures for students, faculty, staff, external stakeholders / partners, and parents to feel nurtured, safe, brave, empowered, included, and supported in their educational journey. She is also a proud parent of an amazing 12-year-old son, stepmom of 2 fabulous adult children, and dog mom of a 7-month-old German Shepherd. She enjoys spending time with family, knitting, sewing, traveling, and creating content for her social media spaces and brand called Black Paper and Cloth, a community for those motivated by style, education, and beauty on occasion. Felicia creates and invites engaging spaces and welcoming experiences that allow individuals to have a place of belonging for themselves and others, to live beautifully and be beautiful. And we have her here today. Welcome, Felicia. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. I remember your first initial outreach, and we've been planning. So I've
been stalking you for a while.
You are great.
I've been trying to hunt you down. No, so the first time I physically met you, the first time I heard about you was on LinkedIn, but the first time I physically met you, I was just definitely impressed by your passion, by your experience, by your expertise in education and working with young people. And so I'm excited to get a chance to talk to you today.
I'm excited. So
let's jump right in, because I have a ton of questions to ask you today as an educator, as a principal, as a person who specializes in molding and shaping the minds of our young people. Talk to me about how you got involved in the educational realm. How did you choose education as your path? I would love to hear about that.
I'm going to say it this way. I think education found me, even though as a child, My dolls were students in a classroom. My sister, who's 5 years younger than me, she was at 2 and 3, a student in my class, along with the dolls. Our mother, though, she's the career educator. She was a teacher for 40 years, and she also had an educational consulting business before educational consulting became a thing. This was the early 80s, actually, 1980s. So our life was surrounded by being in educational spaces, going with her over on the weekends when she's buy school supplies, to buy clothes, to buy things that her students needed, because she spent a lot of her teaching career within working with parochial education and schools within the inner city in Chicago. So we were around this. And then, of course, as like she teaching us, she was a trained Montessori teacher and certified Montessori educator. And so I was, part of our upbringing in the earlier years was Montessori. And then, of course, we matriculated to traditional course of study. So we were a part of this life. But where teaching actually kind of became the path as like the career path, I would say springboarded when I was a sophomore in high school. I went to a predominantly all-girl Catholic high school in Chicago, at the time on Chicago's southwest side of the city. And this was the 1984. So from 1984 to 1988, I was not fully familiar with the community at that time, where you had a lot of working class families. You had a lot of families who their lineage was either Southside Irish or Lithuanian or Polish or, demographics of that nature. And I wasn't too familiar with the history of that particular side of town in the 80s, where the racial lines were really just like drawn. And for those who may be familiar with the city of Chicago, in the earlier years, decades ago, if you crossed Racine or you crossed Western going west, those are kind of like off limits to people of color, and those weren't welcoming communities and spaces. But nonetheless, I went to the Catholic school there. My mom was, she believed in Catholic education. And of course, in those days, you listen to your mother. A couple of my friends lived there. So she's like, you're going there. I'm like, okay. Mm-hmm. And what was intriguing and what I started learning, I'm like, oh, wow, the school is right across the street from Marquette Park, 67th in California. At the time, and this was my naivety, I didn't realize the implication and the impact of knowing that until I studied African American history a bit more robustly, learning that was a community or a park where Dr. Martin Luther King led a march in that side of town when he had visited Chicago, by which he was throwing bottles and bricks and gunshots all over the place. But he wanted to bring, integration and talk about housing and and so on, and just bring the movement into Chicago, which he did, but obviously was met with backlash. So not realizing the history at the time, but later realizing it shifted kind of the why I went into education. That's part one. I was sitting in part two. I was sitting in a world history class. I think it was my freshman year. And the teacher at the time, he was going over the syllabus and what he was going to teach and so on. I don't remember how many girls were in the room, but I know it was myself and another young lady, African-American young lady. So we were the only two, probably in a classroom of 28 students in the class. So the other student, she asked the question. She said, "Oh, when are you going to teach African-American history or African history, Asian history, and other histories of people from other parts of the world?" Because as he was going through the syllabus, he was talking about, he started with early ancient Civ and moving into medieval, Dark Ages and medieval, and then the Renaissance. And then somehow you catapulted from the Renaissance to World War I and World War II. And then that was it. So when she asked the question, and I was really happy that she did, he said, "Oh, I don't teach that." And so I sat there, I'm like, oh, I think I'm going to become a history teacher. Mind it, I didn't like history, and I wasn't thinking about teaching as a profession. But it was at that time I was 14 or 15, and I said, you know what? No, I'm going to be a teacher, and I'm going to be a history teacher. I want to teach high schoolers because I want to be able to bring scholarship to students and the history, the good, the bad, the indifferent, the ugly, the rosy, all of it. And I want to teach full history and teach it factually. So that was kind of the springboard to my thinking as a teen going into this profession as an educator.
So you were a young activist. You were a kid with the passion and the fire to right a wrong that you saw. Talk to me about, because, you're talking about the educational system and the historical context of the city of Chicago and how race has impacted the city and in the surrounding area. As an educator, what role in general does, ethnicity, I hate to use the word race because we're all humans, but what role does ethnicity play in the education of our young people? What are your thoughts on that?
It's interesting. My sister and I, we were having somewhat of a similar conversation just a few days ago, and we were commenting on the number of educators of color there are. I mean, we're a dwindling group, if you will. Mm. And when you think about, like, if you even go back to 1865 and the ending of enslavement of Black people, and you look at the period of Reconstruction, and you notice that within that 10, 11-year span, there was an explosion of schools and Black teachers teaching Black students, because with the explosion of Black schools and, of course, a nation trying to grapple with the new social norms and structures within a society that was used to enslavement for 500 years, and now it's over. And the questions of what do you do? How do you govern? Where do the people who were formerly enslaved, what do you do with them? There was always a need, right, for education being that point of liberation, even for those who were enslaved, who were able to, however, by whatever means, to learn to learn to read, to learn to write during a period of enslavement. And now you have a period where there's such an explosion of, wow, we have access now. There is access. And then, of course, you have Black teachers. And out of that, you still have a society that's kind of, you won't have Black and white students, to just use that Black-white dichotomy ethnically, with sharing the same space academically in academic spaces, because then you see the emergence of an apartheid system. But you saw there was the urgency to educate students of color. And you notice the legacy following that. And even when I was a student in elementary school during the 70s and the 80s, up to mid 80s, all I knew were Black teachers. I mean, I had a few non-Black teachers, white, Asian, or Asian individuals. And the schools that I attended had predominantly Black students. But what I found intriguing about those spaces is that it was this kind of infusion of Black pride. And I'm going to say it this way, like Black pride, but in a non-militant sense, if you will. Nothing wrong with militancy, but it was just like, it was a part of the natural teaching, if you will. And there's a mindset and the way that teachers of color, educators of color, see brown and Black students and education. It's seeing your students through the lens of joy. It's seeing students of color through the lens of brilliance and genius. And it's a different philosophy, not different, but it's a philosophy that's taught, at least in my upbringing, in the way I would teach students, all of my students, that you will be successful. There's not an if. You will be successful. These are the avenues that, as an educator, you're going to be guided into that direction. The scholarship is not mediocre. It's not, oh, let's water it down, or, oh, we don't think you can do it. No, it is, you will get there. You will do this. You are, so the philosophy and the language and even the environment was built for success as a teacher or an educator of color. And that's been my experience. What we've noticed, though, is a shift from let's say, I'm not even going to say predominant, but like an equal kind of, in terms of numerics, maybe an equal division of teachers of color and non-teachers of color. But then there's been a shift where when you look at the data, and I don't have the strict numbers, the majority of educators now coming into the workplace and the workforce would be more white women in those spaces, and white women who are also teaching in predominantly Black spaces or spaces of color. And I would say you would see kind of the numbers shift from the early 2000s, late 90s to early 2000s to the present moment. So we're looking at roughly 24, 25 years, this kind of shift. And with that shift, more like, I'm going to almost say newer scholarship in terms of how to teach and train non-educators of color how to teach children of color. What does it mean to not go in a community thinking you're the great white savior, right? Or to see students from a deficit lens, right? Or through a deficit lens. Or if you have, let's say, non-educators of color who are teaching in predominant non-students of color spaces, and you may have just a very small population of students of color in the classroom, not to see those students, not to ignore them, or not to make them invisible subconsciously or consciously, not to proceed with bias or implicit biases, as the term likes to kind of throw out there. So it's, as an educator of color, I see my charge a lot differently. Any educational space I've been in, my students will be successful. Everyone learns at a different pace, at a different level. And if the end goal is, they're going to be the honor student, and some students can get there faster than others, I'm going to bring everybody there and customize their learning to get to that space. So that, just to, kind of overdo the metaphor and the analogy, that's where I come from and how I think as an educator of color.
I got a follow-up question, because you mentioned the decrease in numbers of Black educators over the last 25 years. This is a two-part question. The first part of the question is, what do you think is the cause of the decrease in numbers of Black educators? And the second part of that question is, what's going to be the outcome of that? We talk about Black educators and how important they are. What happens in an environment where we have a lack of Black educators to educate our kids?
Those are both good questions. And these will be more theories, as I don't have like the hard research in front of me. But let me say it this way. If you look at it in terms of private spaces, educational spaces, and public educational spaces, more and more educators of color would opt for public school spaces, because I'm going to say the great divider would be monetary. It's in terms of salaries, in terms of cost of living. It's in terms of how can one sustain a life in our system. And I think, for example, you may have individuals who would be really interested in teaching in private school or even working in private school spaces, but when the gap is so wide in terms of teachers entering the field as a first-year teacher, and I'm going to speak specifically to Chicago, you may have a teacher interested in teaching in a private or a parochial school, and they may start there as a teacher of color, and we may have like amazing teachers, but how do you sustain if the gap is there's a $30,000 to $40,000 gap between what a public school teacher will get first year versus what a private parochial school teacher will receive. So monetarily, this profession, and I don't want to necessarily say we'll lose teachers, but it's kind of like there's this shift in terms of, well, if I want to teach, I'm going to think public school because I'll get more money, as opposed to maybe private and independent. That's one aspect. Secondly, there are, how can I say this? As an educator, there are a lot of high risk. Oftentimes I would get critics share, oh, well, teaching's easy, or, well, you get the whole summer off. So what's wrong? How come you think your job is so hard? And it's contrary, it's like our job is hard. As an educator, it is hard, especially when you're working with so many personalities and home situations and psychological situations like in front of you, or whether it's in a classroom or in a whole school, and navigating and having to be all things to all people in that kind of space. And with that, you are not just the educator or the administrative leader, but you're also in some ways a surrogate parent. You're also the parent, the individuals who is watching out for the emotional well-being of their students, the academic well-being of your students. You're having to deal with parents, and you have some parents who are very supportive and believe in a very harmonious homeschool or connection or partnership. And you have others who feel very deeply about the experience of their child, and maybe because they lived through maybe some kind of trauma when they were children in school, and they show kind of surface those traumas in certain situations that a teacher or an administrative leader have to help work through. In addition, we always take our work home. There's usually your most effective teachers, they just don't leave the day and it's like, oh, I can show up tomorrow and whatever. We're preparing lessons, we are preparing documents, we are grading papers. So you have that element, but then, and you can, and as an educator, you can manage those things. But then when now you have the safety aspects of the job in a different way that we haven't had to navigate before. Folks, I forget now how many years it's been, over couple of decades since the first school shooting, Columbine. And many of us felt, oh, that was, wow. That was wild, but didn't anticipate it happening again. And then again, right? Mm-hmm. And I remember I was doing a workshop with pre-service teachers who were in college, and this was a part of the Golden Apple program. And these were pre-service students who decided as freshmen that they were going to go into the teaching profession. And so Golden Apple would provide for them access to education through the universities. And it was a funded grant program, and they would also do their student teaching and so on. And I was leading a workshop, and I remember asking, I forget what the exact question I was asking the students at the time in this workshop, but it was centering around like their realm of responsibility and where do they see themselves as an educator or even as a human in terms of their sphere of responsibilities. And one of the students shared whether or not she had to take a bullet for her students. That threw me. I was like, whoa, that wasn't something I thought about when I was in her shoes, decades earlier, learning as a pre-service teacher. But that is something that as educators, we are navigating all the time. Mm-hmm. And even as a society, right? So that's another layer that we are contending with. And so as people are thinking about career and career options, you have the pay, you have the exorbitant amount of emotional, physical, psychological stressors that go along with the job. You also have the huge safety component that goes along with the job. And it's kind of like, do I do education? Do I create a startup business? Do I go into law, medicine, what have you, with a different set of stressors? It's almost like, is the field of education still attractive? And I'm going to say it this way, to educators of color. And I'm going to add one more piece to that. The demographics have been shifting, as I mentioned before. And let's say you may have a few educators of color working in predominantly, let's say, white spaces. And now you're adding, well, how do we provide spaces that are inclusive, or how do we provide spaces that are spaces for belonging? Because you may have an organization that's trying to move in a DEIB, diversity, equity, inclusive space of belonging, but now you have other layers. Well, how do we bring in and make those who are of color feel like they're part of the community and not just a diversity hire or fulfilling a vision or a mission statement or a root belief, but the person of color is not feeling the support that they need. Or, so you have multiple layers with that. And in some spaces, that can be an area where retention and retaining Black or BIPOC identities in those spaces becomes pretty critical. How do you retain them? How do you keep them here? They're amazing folks. How, what will keep those individuals there? So these are like questions that are ongoing, and I'm glad you raised too. And I wish I had like the perfect answer aside from, and I'm going to use the word I brought up a few times, belonging, focusing on what belonging looks like. And we can segue into that however or not, but what does that look like? Because it means a lot when we're looking at education and the ebbs and flows within this industry.
Absolutely. I would definitely like to touch on belonging. So what is and again, I know you said that this may just be your opinion, but as a professional in the time that you've put in the educational realm, your opinion holds a lot of weight. What is the outcome of not having those Black teachers? How's that going to impact our kids 5 years, 10 years, 15 years down the road, in your opinion?
Yeah. I would be concerned with how a student's identity, where would that student's identity kind of be, right? It's like, how would a student see themselves, and what kind of examples would they have to say, oh, I admire that individual that's teaching me, that's educating me. I may want to be a teacher, or at least they're bringing something to the table that I can connect with, right? Mm-hmm. And that becomes like a real point of connecting that non-individuals of color, in my belief, in my opinion, may not necessarily see as something that's truly important unless they're taught like identity is really critical. Mm-hmm. I remember on several occasions, there may be a young girl, student in the class or just in the hallway or what have you, whether they're of color or not, and there will be something that student will feel like a sense of connection to me. Like, for example, a parent, for instance, commented, she said, I am so happy, as I was a principal at another school, and she said, I was so happy that you're here because my daughter sees a mirror of herself in you. I'm like, oh, wow, that's huge. I love that. Another student, male student actually, who was actually a white male student who was really going through some issues at a high school, academic and social emotional and so on. And I remember complimenting him on a pair of gym shoes. And they were really nice gym shoes. And he told his mother, and she told me many years after, because I was doing a training and didn't make the connection that was the child's mother. And we were trying to like identify, oh, where do we know each other from? And she said, oh, wait, I know where you're from. You were the dean of students at the high school. I'm like, yeah. So my son told me about you complimenting him on his shoes. You remember when he didn't want to go to that Saturday program and you encouraged? I'm like, oh, wow. And it's those kinds of connections. But as a face of color, it's integral for our presence to be in educational spaces, whether it's predominantly school of color or not. Our presence needs to be there, need to be in those spaces so that we are providing an example of what our society looks like, who our society is, right? Because there may be some students that may never see a brown face in front of them. And I find that problematic, to be honest with you. And to hopefully mitigate some of the bias that one may have. Oh, you have a Black teacher, you have a Latinx teacher, will they be a good teacher? Will they be a good leader? But something to just like our presence needs to always stay visible, because we do share and have history and kind of like the keepers of legacies as well, so that this is not a lost profession or even a lost option for educators of color. And hopefully I kind of touched on it a little bit, but that's kind of what I'm seeing right now. And I'm sorry. Hopefully that's something that makes some sense. And I feel
Absolutely
pretty good about that.
Absolutely. I got a few more things. We probably only got about 10 or 15 more minutes, but I want to put my cap on as a parent, and I want to ask you some questions. And so, and I'm sure there'll be other parents watching this, maybe other parents of little Black boys and girls. And, I guess the question I have for you is, as a parent who's trying to put my daughters in the best possible situation that they can be in so they can grow and flourish and become, responsible, productive women one day. What are some commonalities of success that you see from a parenting standpoint and being involved in your kids' educational development? And simultaneously, we can also even talk about the adverse of that. What are some commonalities of failure, some mistakes that you maybe see parents, behaviors that you maybe see parents engaging in that's not helpful to the development of their kid? Because you've seen so many things. You've seen, you've experienced it at a teacher level, at an administrative level, at a principal level. What's your experience in those two things? What makes a kid thrive, and what a parent can do to help that? What makes a kid maybe not thrive, and what a parent can do to not support that?
I love this question. So let's start with the not first. And I'm going to say it this way. Never believe that your child or children are incapable of getting advanced studies in something. For example, look at there's two ways to look at this. Observe your children. I know we all do. We look at our kids. Oh yeah, okay. But really see, where does it look as if where their gifts are coming from, or what those gifts may be, and hone in on those gifts. For example, my son, he's got a natural gift for music, and he's picked up sports, and he's got actually a natural gift for learning and really seeking out information for whatever interests he may have. What are those gifts that you may see your child or can't quite identify what those gifts are? I'm going to kind of lean now to what the Word of God says, to train up the child in the way they should go, and when they grow old, they will not depart. Where do you want to see your child? Every parent should have a vision for their child. Every parent should have a vision for their child. And not having a vision is actually quite dangerous for your child. We can all say, yeah, we want our children to be successful, but think about, what does success look like? For some, just getting a secure job. Okay, that's fine. Or for those who are entrepreneurs, hey, I want my child to be able to take the business and move forward with it. But identify and make it tangible, not like so far it's out there. But with it being tangible, I'm going to say it this way, couple what's real, like the realistic goals, but also think pie in the sky too. Think even broader than that. Like, wow. And not so much where, oh, wow, this is too big. Wow, it's not too big. Where do you see your children, right? We want them healthy. We want them successful. We want them smart. Always encourage that. And then model it too. It's one thing to say, so never be just do as I say, not as I do kind of person or parent. Actually model. If you want your children to be excellent readers, how often do we read as parents, right? If we, or if we want our children to get into like the love of museums or what have you, well, do we take our children to the museums? Are we there to cover and guide? Always see your children, especially for our children of color, see them as joy, see them as genius, see them as amazing, speak positive words out. And sometimes, and as parents, we're all guilty of this. Sometimes because we want our children to do well, and we sometimes, in our discipline, we may not be as affirming. Got to remember to always be affirming. Remember to use the word, like think about yourself. How do you function? Like, we function as humans with criticism or encouragement. Children need the same thing, right? So I kind of mixed in the do's and the don'ts at the same time. But in our do's and in our nurturing, we are visionaries. And we are, and we need to craft that vision into our children. We want our children to be motivated. Let them see you as motivated, right? At least make this a part of the environment. I remember my mom, she was always about creating positive environmental situations, speaking life-giving words, if you will, seeing the glass half full. Some people may be like, oh, it's not realistic. Well, I don't know. I'm 53, and for me, it's worked, to live a positive lifestyle and to understand. And this is something huge too that I've seen just a shift in terms of, like, I'm going to sound like maybe a little old, kind of generational shift. Not have our students know what it feels like to fail, but how to problem solve out of that. That failure is not bad, or a setback isn't bad. Does it feel uncomfortable? Yes. And we help our students process that. But what does success look like? How do we, there's still a goal. How do we shift and still realize that goal? What I've been seeing more and more of are parents shielding their children from failures, from setbacks, from competition. Competition, there's a place for it. We're in the generation where everybody's a winner. Okay, I love that. But there's some work that goes with that too, right? So there's this balance, and I can go on. But those are kind of my top outliers with that one. Encouraging, motivating, teaching our children problem-solving skills, and as parents, making sure that our language, our behaviors, our actions are those that are fruitful, life-giving, and will empower our students, our children.
That's good. That's good. As we wrap up, I have my last few questions here. And so I guess the big question I have for you as an educator, as a person who's devoted your career, a huge portion of your life to molding and shaping young people, what role, I know you mentioned reading earlier. And, if you want your kids to be a reader, it's important for you to model that reading with them. What role does a parent play when it comes to not only just setting the example for their kid, whether it's reading, work ethic, or all of those other things, but how important is it I'm trying to figure out how to say this. How important is it for a parent to model being a student themselves, like continuing to learn themselves, continuing to develop themselves. Do you see a commonality in your students where it's like, my top students, their parents usually have these kind of habits, whereas, or they come from this kind of family that has, do you see any connection to that? Or is it just like some kids just have this personality where they were going to be destined to succeed, whether they came from the broken home with the parents who just watch TV all day, and some kids were destined to maybe not excel, even though they come from a home with a college-educated mom and dad who are professors, and they read. What are your thoughts on that?
It's all of it, actually. It's all of it. I have seen the highly motivated child come from households that you would question, like, oh boy, that parenting is not quite, what we see as fruitful or something, and the child, and you can see they have this, I'm going to almost say innate desire to not connect, if you will, with the parent who's not as engaged or as active. And then, of course, you see those who may be overly entitled and kind of feel, well, I don't really have to do much, or I can just kind of glide along. There's not a perfect scheme, but I think, and this is where educators come in very handy, because despite whatever the parenting situation is, despite whatever the household situation is, every child, as they go into their school, academic place of learning, there's a consistency there that everyone understands. And there's an expectation there at school, at least that's the hope, that children will connect to, students will connect to, they understand. In a well-functioning school where academic excellence is like the high standard, SEL and diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging it makes up the fabric of the school. The space is welcome. Parents are welcome. It's a well-functioning school. Regardless of wherever the children are, like whatever households and backgrounds they're coming from, they know at least there for the next 6 hours, for 5 days of that week, and several weeks after that, there is going to be a consistent message. They're going to glean from and get their inspiration. Even the ones that we may have to nudge a little bit, because there's always going to be those few that we got to nudge a little bit, but we still stay affirming and encouraging. And as teachers, providing and providing resources and being supportive of those resources, sometimes having those hard conversations with families to encourage their children or families to, for example, seek out additional learning resources for their children. Or if there's a child there may be some observed evidence of maybe a neurodivergent component that's kind of detouring the learning process, and having that conversation with the parent to maybe consider an evaluation for that child to receive the kind of resources they need to unlock the learning. Schools have traditionally been and will continue to be that place, to kind of like that meeting place for all different kinds of households and all different types of students with the varying temperaments and the varying work ethics. That's going to be the hub for, I'm going to say, safety, security, for positive development, and for that inspiration, and for that kind of that encouragement. And yeah, so it's kind of all of that. But school is that hub, and school will be that wraparound, that, with everything considering to support the students and the households and the families.
Absolutely. Ms. Clotsworthy, I want to thank you for taking the time to share your wisdom and your insight today. Thank you for creating that hub, that safe space for so many of our young people. Thank you for the dedication that you put into your life to build your career around making a difference and an impact in young people's lives. And those young people go on to be adults, and they make an impact in the world in the communities that we live in. I appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today. And thank you so much for sharing with us today.
Thank you for having me, Mr. Jackson. I am so excited And I hope to be on again at some other time.
Absolutely. Absolutely.